Thanks everybody for showing up tonight. We're going to talk about one of my favorite new books that impacts my understanding of what goes on in Alcoholics Anonymous in the early days. And one of my favorite authors, Stephen Prothero, is here with us tonight. And when I first started doing presentations on my book, I had very pointedly written the book in a way that people wouldn't know that I was in AA. So one of the things I realized I had to answer quickly was I had to tell people I was in AA. They thought I was some sort of academic, just writing academically. Well, we've got an academic with us tonight who's writing academically because he's not in Alcoholics Anonymous. He's probably the only one on this call who's in that zone or that mode. So you should take that under advisement when you kind of process this conversation we're going to have. So Stephen's book is God the Bestseller, and the subtitle of that book is How One Editor, that would be Eugene Exman, Transformed American Religion, a book at a time. So I'd like to start off by having Stephen just tell us a little bit about who he is and what he does for a living, because he's a particularly well-qualified man to be writing a book about American religion in the 20th century. Stephen?
Well, thanks, Bill. Thank you for reaching out to me after you found the book and for engaging in a bunch of conversations with me about it. And thank you, David, for having me here, despite my lack of qualifications to join you all. And thank everyone else for coming. Bill asked, what I do. Well, I'm a professor of American religion at Boston University. I also write books. I often spend more time writing books than I do teaching. And in fact, I just retired a couple months ago from BU, so I can spend all my time writing books instead of half my time doing that or more. I started out my career as an academic with a PhD in religious studies, writing mostly about Buddhism in America, how Buddhism changed when it came to the US. I did a book about the history of cremation that I thought was related to the ways that Americans viewed and incorporated and understood and adapted to religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, because cremation is the form of disposal of the dead for much of of Asia. And then I started writing more popular books. I did a book on the history of Jesus in the United States, how Americans viewed Jesus over time. And later in my career, I started writing more about what is called religious literacy, really just what Americans know about religion and why they should know more, because politicians are so frequently quoting from the Bible or saying, how we should be a Christian nation or whatever that might be. So I kind of got involved in those religion and politics sorts of questions. And I've also written about comparative things about the world's religions. I think this particular book that we'll talk about sort of fits in that weird trajectory, in that Exman was particularly interested in Asian religions, as was Bill Wilson. And so moving into this more particular kind of study that kind of takes me back to the origins of my work, where I was working mostly in archives, seems to fit a little bit with link the end of my career and the beginning, or maybe not the end, but the latter years of my career and the beginning.
All right. And one of the things that knocked me out when you and I first talked, and also when I read your book, you mentioned archives. I mean, and I'm a primary document guy. I like to be basing whatever it is I'm telling people about early A history on actual documents that were written during the time of early A history. And you got this great story about finding, just falling into this treasure trove of documents about Eugene Exman. And can you just share with the group how that went down, and how that's like a historian's dream, that could possibly happen. So
yeah, well, thanks for sharing my enthusiasm for that piece of the story. I mean, the way it happened is about 10 years ago, this woman approached me at a party. She was a friend of my mother's, an acquaintance of my mother, and she said she wanted me to come by her house to look at her father's books on religion. And I've actually had this happen a lot. People say, "Oh, you're a professor of religion. You should come look at my father who was an Episcopal minister, or my father who was a Baptist minister, come look at his books. And I've done that a few times, and it's usually not particularly fun for me. So I sort of put it off, and I called her back. She was in the middle of a family crisis. Her son had just died. And so we decided to do it some other time. By the time I called back again, she had also passed away. And I ended up dealing with her husband, who turned out to be the son-in-law of the topic of my book. But I didn't know anything about that when I showed up at his house. And I showed up at his house. I went into the library, and I was really intrigued that the religion books were 20th century books, which usually, when I'm asked to come see a book collection, they're usually older. And they were really mid 20th century books, like really running from more the 20s and 30s through the 60s, which I later found out was when this gentleman, the son-in-law of the man who had let me into his house, was a famous editor at Harper and Row, also called Harper and Brothers. And so I started looking at his books, and the very first book I pulled off the shelf was Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King. It was Martin Luther King's first book. It's about the Montgomery bus boycott. And I opened it up, and inside was a letter from Coretta Scott King. And it said, dear Gene, thank you so much for your support of the civil rights movement. I later found out that Exman went down to Montgomery to meet with the Kings, to meet with Martin Luther King Jr., to ask him to write his first book. And that's a book that Exman ended up editing and publishing, along with Martin Luther King's second and third books. The second book I pulled off the shelf was the Big Book of AA. I apologize. I should have taken that off the shelf first, Bill, but it didn't. It didn't catch my eye as quickly, although it was bigger. But I opened it up, and inside there was a long inscription signed by Bill Wilson, and it said, dear Gene, you're such a close friend. So grateful to you for the ways you've contributed to the founding of AA and the publication of not only this book, but other books. Turned out Exman published two later AA books that were also, co-published by AA's publishing arm, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, and also AA Comes of Age. But so there I am, 15 minutes into the house, and I'm like, who the heck is this guy who had some important role in the civil rights movement, and also in the founding of AA? So I keep looking through, and I find books by all sorts of other important figures. Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, probably going to be an American Catholic saint, officially recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. Those processes are already underway. Exman published her autobiography, The Long Loneliness, and many other books, including by Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Perennial Philosophy, who wrote Brave New World, and was also a friend of Exman. So anyway, this is already going on too long, but I'm looking at these books, and I've never heard of this guy. And so I turn to Walter, who's the son-in-law, and I say, okay, this is fascinating. I love these books, but as I open these books, I keep finding letters. I keep finding postcards. I keep finding notes that are inside the books. Do you have his papers? And he sort of, rolled his eyes up. He's like, oh my God, this family, they never threw anything away. And of course, for a historian, that's like, ding, ding, ding. So, so I go home, I Google him, I Google Exman, I try to find his archive. I try to find where he's given his papers to Columbia University, to, where's he given his papers? And I can't find them. I find 32 boxes of books at Columbia for a 2-volume series that Exman wrote about Harper and Brothers. He wrote 2 books, kind of a history of that publishing house, but I don't find any of his personal stuff. And so I go back to Walter a few days later, and I said, I really think his stuff is here, and I really think it's out there in the barn, which was a barn out behind his house. And I noticed it had a really nice roof. It did not have leaky windows. And over the next 6 months to a year, Walter would just call me up every few months and say, "Hey, Steve, I found another box of books. Hey, Steve, I found another box of letters." And he would just bring them in and put them in his dining room. And I set up there at my own little office, going through what I figured out pretty quickly it would have to be my next book.
Yeah, yeah. That's just we all have like dreams about that kind of stuff happening. We're gonna find that, but
Yeah, and among the things, one of the fights I had with Walter was he kept wanting to throw stuff away because he was trying to clean out his house, after his wife had died, and there was all this, crap in the house and in the barn, and so he was really eager to throw it away. And so when I would go over there, often he would just have trash bags sitting that he was ready to take to the dump, and I would say to him, "What's in there?" And he would say, "Oh, there's nothing in there." And I'd say, "Well, let me decide that. Let me look." So one of the bags was a bunch of Christmas cards that he had thrown away, a huge trash bag full of Christmas cards that he was ready to throw away. And I looked through them and I found 2 or 3 Christmas cards from Bill and Lois Wilson to Exman, along with some other really important, figures that had written Christmas cards to him. And that was one way that I was able to sort of track, as a historian, to sort of track the range of his friendship network, people who are close enough to him to be sending him Christmas cards. So anyway,
and you were a responsible scholar in the sense that you got this entire archive placed at the Middlebury College. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Walter was very keen on placing the books. Like, that was what was in his mind. There's all these books, they should stay together, they should go somewhere. And I explained to him over the course of a few weeks that, the books are interesting, especially the books that are signed and inscribed, and they're historically important, but they don't have a lot of value, and there wouldn't be a lot of universities who would keep them together. They would probably keep 50 books or something that are important, and then they get rid of the rest, sell them to some bookseller, like maybe, Bill Schaberg or something. But what really mattered was the papers. And so he and his daughter decided to give the papers to Middlebury, in part because I had a connection there with the president, Laurie Patton, who is a scholar of Hinduism and also a poet. So she has religion and literature combined interest, and she was very interested in taking on the papers and processing them the way that they need to be processed, which is often very expensive. So yes, the papers are now residing in Middlebury.
Well, congratulations on a good job done with that. That's really great. Listen, the thing that really impressed me about your book when I read it was this, in people who are doing early AA history, especially, and we're all amateurs here, we're always reading books that were written by people. So we'll read something by Emmett Fox, who, by the way, Emmett Fox was published by Eugene Exman. So, yeah. Or we're looking at the books that were written about the Oxford group at the time. I'm currently going through I Was a Pagan again, to get a feel of what was going on in 1934 in New York City in the Oxford group. But what I got from your book was, Gene Exman started at Harper Brothers when he was a young man. It was like 1927 or 1928, and he didn't retire until 1965. But what you track with your book as you follow these different people that he published and the different changes that were going on with him was this arc of what was happening in religion and spirituality in the United States of America from the early 30s all the way up until 65. It just kills me that, at one point you talk about what Exman was doing in the late 20s. He was publishing sermons by Methodist ministers and things like that. And by the time we get to post-World War II, he's got the Bhagavad Gita coming out and all kinds of other things going on. And this guy was tremendously influential. I don't think it's an overstatement. Your subtitle of the book is How One Editor Transformed American Religion, a Book at a Time. And although it's a kind of a steal off of the AA one day at a time thing, but we're going to let you have that one. That's okay. I was knocked out because I have never had that kind of meta perspective on the arc of what was going on in religion and spirituality in America during this time. And I started, as a lot of people on this call know, anytime we get close to this topic, I say, you never read this book? You got to read this book. This is a hell of a book. It tells you the soil. And we always say that the Oxford group was the particular soil that Alcoholics Anonymous grew out of. But what your book gave me was the larger picture on the soil of what was going on there. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about the arc as you see it as a professional professor of American religion. I mean, this is your wheelhouse, right?
Right. So, when we teach courses on American religion, there's so many ways to do it. But when I started out back in the day, a few decades ago, you would tell the story of maybe it would start in New England with the Puritans, and there would be the Great Awakening, and all these people would convert to Christianity in the 1700s. And then evangelicalism, as we know it, like born again Christianity, would emerge in the 1830s, and the Catholics would come with different immigration waves. And maybe there'd be some mention of, Buddhists start to arrive with the Chinese immigrants in the 1830s and 1840s, and Japanese Buddhists arrive in the 1890s, and that sort of thing. So, we're sort of trained to kind of place these things inside some kind of broad sweep. And of course, there's all kinds of contested views about if you really want to tell the story from the Puritans forward, or that's kind of silly because there were indigenous people here before that, and there were Catholics here before the Protestants came, and my, Norwegian people, came before those other sailors across to what came to be called the New World or the Americas. But the middle of the 20th century is so formative for how we live today. And you can, historians of US history or American religion can find antecedents for just about anything that's happening now. But I was particularly struck by Exman's career, where, like you said, early on, well, first of all, when he arrives in New York in the late 1920s, religion publishing is taking off. It is the roaring 20s. We're not yet into the Great Depression. We're not yet into the stock market crash of Black Tuesday or Thursday, whatever that day was. And so things are booming, and they're hiring, the different publishing houses are realizing that it's useful to sell into the religion space. But the way that they conceive of that religion space is, here's a Lutheran minister who has all these sermons. Let's write a book about it. Let's publish it in a Lutheran publishing house. Let's put it into a Lutheran bookstore, and let's sell it to Lutherans who walk into the bookstore and think about buying these kinds of books. Like, that was the market. And Exman had this big idea, which wasn't that different from Bill Wilson's idea that we should be marketing this AA revolution to everybody, and not just to Christians only, or not just to people who have had a conversion experience only, but we should be selling it, missionizing, if you want to say, really, really broadly. And Exman had a similar idea. Let's not do denominations. Let's do religion. Let's not even do Christianity, too narrow. Let's sell these religion books to religious people. And of course, what that word religion means is going to change over time. But for him, that gradually grows to the point where he is getting people like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who's the most well-known Protestant preacher of the 1930s and into the 40s. And he's saying, why don't you write a book of sermons? That's fine. I'll publish that. But how about this? Why don't you write a book about what it is to be a real person, what it is to be a human being, based on your counseling that you're doing with these various people? Because that won't just sell to Baptists like you. That won't just sell to Christians like you. That will sell potentially to all sorts of people, even maybe non-religious people. And that theme of, in the big book, the debates that Bill documents so well about, do we want this to be an anti-religious book? Like, some people were, Parkhurst was pushing him to do. Do we want it to be a religious book? Do we want it to be a Christian-y book? And so Exman is like right in the middle of that. And he is opening up the American religion space to what we call more pluralistic understandings of religion. So the Buddhists and the Hindus should be in on the conversation, along with the Catholics and the Protestants and the Jews. But he's also pushing it in what is called a more personalist direction. Like religion is about individual experience. It's about the person. It's not about the church. It's not about the hierarchy. It's not necessarily even about the community, but it's about the dramatic experiences of a particular individual. So there's a lot more to say about that. But one other thing to say is the context for me that's really important for Exman and for AA is the period between World War I and World War II, where you have people like Bill Wilson and people like Exman and people like Aldous Huxley, the novelist, who are all in this crisis where the world seems to be falling apart, where the modernist vision that everything was going to become better day after day after day after day is gone, where war is now happening in Europe in the mid to late 30s, before the US gets into the war in the early 1940s. And one subgroup of people responding to that, including Bill Wilson and Exman, are saying religion is the key. Like, we need some kind of religious revival. We need some kind of reawakening to spirituality, whatever you want to call it. And they go on this search for meaning individually, but also with each other. And so the way I see Wilson and AA and Exman is engaged in a common search for meaning in a time when meaninglessness seemed to be creeping in from every corner, and when it became really hard to think of how you could have a purposeful and fulfilled life, given the way the world was falling apart all around us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You know, I just finished reading your book for the second time in preparation for this conversation. And, you know, it's always funny when you go back and read something a second time that, like, how come I didn't see that last time? How did I miss that? Of course, I'm still looking in the big book and finding things that they slipped in since the last time I actually read that chapter, but that's another story completely. One of the things that I was knocked out by this time reading the book was how prominent William James is throughout this book. I mean, I didn't, if I circled every time William James's name or the varieties of religious experience came up and counted them up, I bet you there's at least one for every page of your book, because it's just, he's such a motive force here. And the way in which you explain this movement in the late 20s, let's say 1920s, where we're talking religion, which is dogma based, to getting into the 60s where we're having spiritual personal experience. It's a personal experience model as opposed to signing off on the Nicene Creed, for instance. And of course, you just constantly reference on James. So I gotta think I'm a very big William James fan myself. I read a lot of William James, but I'd love you to just talk a little bit about James and his importance to this movement from religious, quote unquote, religious, dogmatic to individual spiritual experience.
Yeah. So, from religion to spirituality, or from organized religion to personal spirituality, is the kind of the broad arc of the book. So this wasn't my idea at the beginning. I didn't think this story had anything to do with William James when I started it. Then I found a letter by Exman to his daughter. She was taking a psych course in college. She said she hated the professor. Why did she hate the professor? Because the professor thought that all her dad's friends were idiots, because he was into parapsychology. He was into Ouija boards. He was into, precognition. He was into speaking to spirits of the dead. And he thought that deserved to be studied. Now, so did William James. William James was the founder, perhaps, of the field of psychology. He was also a key professor of philosophy at Harvard, professor of philosophy and of psychology. And I'm losing my train of thought because little things keep popping up on the screen. But the important thing that happened is that his daughter writes to him and says, Dad, what's up with this? He actually writes to his wife, to Exman's wife. And Exman writes back and he says, listen, you need to do the work. You might hate your professor. You might hate what you're reading. You think it's too skeptical. It's not open-minded enough. But, you really should read this book. You should read The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And you should ask your professor if you can read it for credit, because it's a book that should be read in any intro to psychology class. You should read the founder of the discipline that you are engaged in studying. And so that kind of cued me into being aware of James. But then as I was going through each chapter, Dorothy Day, Harry Emerson Fosdick, Martin Luther King, they all just kept referencing William James. Every single person that I was reading that he was publishing, including Bill Wilson, was referencing William James. And what were they saying about him? They were saying that they were, in my view, finding 4 things. And they all start with P, which my name's Prothero. Maybe that's why they all start with P. I don't know. But they do. One was pluralism, that truth is plural. Like there isn't just one singular sort of truth. That kind of prayer invocation that you started with, make my mind have, I don't know the language, but, make me open, make me willing to challenge my own preconceptions. Well, why? Because truth is not so simple. Everybody nowadays in American culture, unfortunately, seems to just think they know they have the truth and everybody else is an idiot. And so he had this idea of pluralism, that truth was plural in some important way, and therefore we had to search after it. It wasn't just, we didn't just hold it, like we couldn't just have the Bible and then we had the truth, or just listen to our favorite professor and then we had the truth. So pluralism, both philosophically and also religiously, that different religious traditions have things to teach to other religious traditions. And in James' Varieties of Religious Experience, that idea of pluralism is right there in the title, the varieties of religious experience. There isn't one religious experience, there's all these different kinds of religious experience. And that's what he documents in that book. The other is pragmatism, the other P, pluralism and pragmatism. And James's pragmatism said that the way you know the truth is in part, and maybe largely, by its effects. Like, what does it do? You say you have found this new truth. Well, what does it do to you? Does it make you a kinder person? Does it make you a better person? Does it make you evil? Does it make you mean? Like, what does it do to you? And in general, when we encounter a religious truth claim or a philosophical truth claim, if it's doing good in the individual and in the world, we have reason to imagine that it might be true. And then the third P, for James and also for Exman's, what I call his book of books, like the thousands of books that he publishes, the hundreds of bestsellers that he publishes, that kind of collection of his books also exhibits this pluralism and this pragmatism. And the other is perennialism, the idea that the religions are essentially the same, that they might be different in certain aspects, but those aspects are unimportant. And in the really important aspects, they are the same. And for James, the really important aspect, and for Exman, and maybe Bill Wilson, we can debate that, I think maybe, the key thing was mysticism, the encounter of the individual soul with the divine, that was the key thing that happened in religion. The key thing wasn't getting baptized. The key thing wasn't being confirmed. The key thing wasn't memorizing the Bible or reading the Bible. The key thing was some kind of intense personal encounter with God, which was available to everyone, or with whatever you call God, that, whatever you want to say, that might be. And then the last piece is personalism. And this was a philosophical movement that really influenced Martin Luther King. It was why he went to Boston University. It was for his PhD in philosophy. It was the people he studied with. And they made a kind of theological claim that God was a person and that to encounter God was a personal encounter. But the people who were philosophers of personalism said that, truth is always personal. It isn't institutional. It isn't like abstractly universal across all human history. It's very personal. So all these elements from James and from James' Varieties of Religious Experience, I believe, had a profound influence on Exman, profound influence on the books that he published, profound influence on Bill Wilson and on the AA movement, and through all those influences on contemporary American culture, where people are much more inclined to think of the value of religion as plural, as personal, as pragmatic, and even as, you know, all religions are one, like this idea of the perennial philosophy.
Thank you. Good.
So I was drawn in a little kicking and screaming. I was okay when James kept coming up, but I finally felt I just had to follow that, what I was finding in the archives.
Good. Because, you know, it's funny to me that William James keeps coming up in a lot of things I read. And, you know, that's not true of even Freud and Jung don't show up with any kind of regularity in the stuff I read. But it seems like William James is always popping up. He's relevant in a way that is just kind of surprising and shocking for who he was and where he came from and the time in which he was doing all of that stuff. But he's still a player in a lot of people's intellectual lives, and I'm happy about that. Now, a whole bunch of people here are probably wondering, what the devil does this guy Exman have to do with Alcoholics Anonymous and Bill Wilson? Well, the story, if you're not familiar with it, is that one of the Rockefeller guys, Frank Amos, told Bill Wilson when he had 2 chapters of the book that he had this friend who was down at Harper Brothers named Eugene Exman. I didn't know at the time he was the religion editor. I had to read this book to learn that. But he had this, and he said, why don't you go down there and see if he'd be willing to publish this book you're trying to write? So Wilson and Parkhurst go down, and they do the presentation. And Eugene Exman actually wants to publish the book. He offers Bill Wilson a $1,500 advance against future sales. And Harper's looking, this is right up his wheel. This is exactly the kind of stuff he does for a living. So he's looking to publish this book. And Hank Parkhurst talks Bill Wilson out of publishing the book with anybody but self-publishing. So they end up self-publishing the book. And I think that's one of the big turning points in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. So that's what Eugene Exman is doing here as far as an AA thing. And you should know that I think there's like 8 or 9 chapters in the book, and the last major chapter on a person is about Bill Wilson. And he wrote a bit. They were friends. These guys were friends throughout his life. But one of the things I love that Exman actually wrote about Bill Wilson in a way, you know, in a first person kind of way. So now we're getting the horse's mouth kind of thing here. And this is on page 248-49 of Steve's book. He said, Wilson, who stood 6'2" tall, quote, was always having trouble as to how to manage his long legs. And I remember how he twisted them around each other and the legs of his chair, Exman wrote. Quote, he rumpled his hair and tried to wipe the disappointment off his face, end quote, after Exman set down the royalty terms he was offering. Quote, you mean, Wilson asked, that I would only get 15% or 45 cents off a $3 book? God, that is such a great snapshot of Bill Wilson in action. And this would have been
we just lost you.
1948. I locked up there for a second, but anyhow, I love it when you can just get that kind of a personal look at the guy. So but it wasn't just this encounter that they had in October of 1938 about the publication or not publication of the book. These men shared quite a lot of different things. Eugene Exman had himself let's call it a white light experience, just for shorthand, when he was 15 years old. And of course, Bill had his famous white light experience in Towns Hospital in 1934. So they had that in common. And they were really, one of the things that Steve brings out in his book was that both of those guys were kind of chasing that experience. They were looking to get that experience again. They wanted to touch the face of God in that same way again. They were seekers after whatever it was going to do to get them to that place. And that they go through, Steve mentioned the fact that Exman was into parapsychology. And of course, Bill Wilson was doing the same thing with the Ouija boards and you know, mediums speaking with dead people and things like that. But over and above that, you know, Bill Wilson ends up going out to California in is it the mid 40s, I think, and then Exman has him out there at Tribuco, which is this kind of a commune that got it's commune out there by Gerald Hurd and Aldous Huxley. And, you know, these are guys that are trying to change the world. They're on a program to change the world. And Bill Wilson goes out there and he gets involved with them. And he does a lot of serious and important spiritual work out there with those people. He's involved with the projects that they're trying to get. And that leads to both Eugene Exman and Bill Wilson taking acid in the late 50s. That's kind of where that all tracks to. And of course, a lot of people in AA, they start hearing about Bill Wilson dropping acid. That's the wrong phraseology. That's 1960s terminology. This was a very controlled kind of thing. But I don't know, Steve, would you like to talk about that a little bit, about what those guys were? Because I think it's just amazing that, so this is 1938, Bill's pitching the book. He really meets the guy for the first time, but here he is in the late 50s. This is like 20 years later, and they're still hanging out together, and they're still looking for that white light experience, that kind of, how can they reconnect with what Wilson called in one of his writings, the first version of the There Is a Solution, he called it the living God. They're looking for the living God here.
I thought we were going to wait to talk about LSD till the end, so we didn't lose too many people. But that's okay. You kind of jump right in there. But before we do that, just one thing about the publication of the book, because you talk about how Parkhurst talked Wilson out of it. Exman's memory is that a good bit of it was Wilson as the good stockbroker guy figuring out the vig that was going to, I wouldn't pay that percentage, if I'm buying a stock, why would I, pay this crazy percentage to the publisher? But, to Exman's credit, Exman also, at least in his telling of the story, Exman advised him not to publish with Harper. And this wasn't that unusual. Exman did this with other people. He saw what he was doing as a money-making enterprise, but he also thought as a mission. He initially wanted to go as a missionary to China. He got a job offer to go as a missionary to China, to Beijing, in his early 20s, right after college. He didn't go, and he got this offer from Harper, and he went to a minister friend of his and asked, should I take this job? And the minister said to him, this can be your calling. This can be your mission in life. And so I think he liked Bill Wilson. I think he saw the potential importance of AA. And he, in his telling, said to Wilson, you're starting a movement. You should be in charge of your own scripture. This is going to be your scripture, and you should be in charge of it. So anyway, Exman was among the people who he certainly wasn't saying, oh, don't listen to that Parkhurst guy. You got to publish with me. Otherwise, nobody's going to read your book. Anyway, that piece. I mean, the other piece, so much was shared between these two guys. I mean, the mysticism is a really important part. I mean, almost everybody who Exman published was a mystic. I mean, this seems weird now. How many mystics do you know? I mean, I only know one. It's not like everybody I know can say, oh yeah, I remember the day that everything was normal, and then all of a sudden God appeared to me when I was riding on a horse, or God appeared to me, when I was standing in Winchester Cathedral or whatever. That's not like normal stuff that happens, but just about everybody, including William James, by the way, had one that he wrote about in Varieties of Religious Experience, where he disguised himself. He, pretended it was someone else, but it was him. So Exman was really attracted to these people. He wanted to have it happen again. And so when he would meet someone like Wilson and he'd get to know them and they'd start to say, oh, let me tell you, this thing happened to me, he would lean in, he would tell his own story to them. And then they would try to talk about strategies like, well, wait a minute, how did that come on? What were you doing? Can we repeat some of that in some way so that it can happen again? Because why? Because the world needs this. The world needs connection with God. And the way that's going to happen is one individual at a time, right? Not that different from like saving one individual at a time from the ravages of alcohol, saving one individual at a time from sin or whatever, whatever it might be. So that was really important. But, you know, a lot of people, when they think of mysticism, they think of navel gazers who are kind of withdrawing from the world, and they're, you know, oh, okay, all these other people have problems, but, you know, I got to focus on my problems. So I'm going to like meditate, or I'm going to, you know, do yoga, or whatever I'm going to do. And I'm going to sit in my little office, and I'm going to not encounter anybody because this whole thing is really difficult. I'm going to be like the Buddha, you know, who left his family and went off and roamed around. And, you know, and Exman wasn't interested in that. He believed, as Wilson believed, that, and as James believed, that if you have a genuine mystical experience, that's going to call you to engagement with others. That's going to call you to service with others, right? That's this, you know, in AA, and again, I'm no expert in AA, but you know, this being there for other people is such a huge part, right? And there's a sort of a virtual loop, feedback loop of, you know, the benefit it does to you doing benefits to others, right? And then the more benefits come to you, the more you're able to help others, right? This was very much the way that Exman thought about mysticism, and that so many people who he talked to thought about mysticism. He and Wilson were both, you know, intra-war, you know, they came of age between World War I and World War II. We're on the, you know, cusp of the end of World War I, going into World War II. And so they were on this search. They were on this search for meaning. They believed that society was falling apart, and it was creating all sorts of social problems, including the ravages of alcohol, including the military-industrial complex. Many of Exman's friends were pacifists too, whose ethics led them in that pacifist direction. And then also, Bill Wilson and Exman shared both a background in Christianity and a healthy skepticism about Jesus people, for lack of a better word. But neither of them was interested in, you know, this. I think there's a place where in the book where I quote from Bill Wilson, and Bill, maybe you can help me with this quote, but where he's talking about the Oxford group, and how some of them seem to be kind of sanctimonious, and they seem to be you know, they're better educated and wealthier than we are, you know, and that's important to them. And Exman, when he would go on these, he would go on a bunch of retreats, and he would run retreats, and the retreats, and Wilson came on some of those retreats out west. And some of the splintering often would happen between like the real Jesus-y, like the religion of Jesus people, and then the sort of Christians who, you know, were really into religion, if that makes any sense, right? In other words, they didn't pray to Jesus. You know, they weren't thinking about Jesus when they were thinking about, they were thinking Jesus was an example of someone who had an intimate relationship with God, right? Rather than like, I have all these sins and Jesus is going to take them away, that sort of thing. So I think Wilson and Exman shared that as well. And they shared, as I've said, their interest in parapsychology. And they shared this idea that religion was fundamentally about experiential, and that the other stuff that religion did really wasn't that valuable, and maybe it was hurtful. You know, the rituals, the scriptures, the clergy, the dogmas, the, you know, the rules, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. And one of the things they did at the end was get into that LSD stuff.
So we got to talk about the LSD.
You know what? There's something else I really want to make sure I get to here, because I think we should give some people some time for Q&A here.
Yeah.
One of the things I get the impression, I don't know that you actually explicitly say this in your book, but I certainly got the impression reading this book that you think Alcoholics Anonymous, and maybe even the book Alcoholics Anonymous, is tremendously influential, shall we say, in this arc of this transition from the 1930s into the 1960s of religion being dogmatically based into spirituality being individual experience based. And so, I mean, as I say, I think the whole book is about that when you talk about Dorothy Day and you talk about Albert Schweitzer and you talk about Martin Luther King. But You end up talking about Bill Wilson as a major, and his movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, as being a major player in that transition.
Yeah, so that really surprised me. And I really was pushed this way by Ann Taves, who is a scholar who's written a wonderful book. Oh man, I'm spacing the title now. It'll come to me before we're done. And where she writes about 3 case studies about religions of revelation of a sort, where something comes to someone. And one of them is about AA that she talks about. And she's really quite knowledgeable about AA. She's very interested in religion and neuroscience. And she read the book, parts of it at different times. And she really pushed me in this direction, which I am now totally committed to, which is that Bill Wilson was way out ahead of Exman on the religious pluralism front. So when Exman was still publishing largely for Christians and Jews, and not even so much Catholics, but like Protestants, a little Catholics, and a little bit towards Jews, Wilson was erasing the word religion from the big book and inserting the word spirituality. He was erasing the word God and inserting other words for God that were more capacious, that were less likely to be read as Jewish and Christian specific words. And so when we, in my field of American religion, try to tell this story of how the United States moved from being a predominantly Christian nation to one that is profoundly religiously diverse and also has a majority of its citizens who value religious diversity, not, of course, the Christian nationalists now who are engaged in a backlash against that idea, right? I mean, that's happening, but in some way, that backlash is showing the power of this movement that Exman and Bill Wilson were involved with. And so I think as Exman is encountering Bill Wilson, he's sort of saying like, oh, yeah, I still think of the word religion as a really capacious, open word, like inclusive of so many things, right? As opposed to Christianity, right? Like you move from Christianity to religion, now all of a sudden you can be publishing books about Buddhism and Hinduism, whereas before you were publishing about Christian denominations. But I think that he just started to see the language needs to open up. We need to think more about spirituality, less about religion. We need to think more about God as you understand God and less about God, right? As if we understood God. And I think that kind of loosening up of the borders of the topic, and or to put it in Exman's terms, the extremes of the books he could publish, I think that Wilson played a really important role. And I think AA, because Wilson wasn't the only player, right? As he's writing the big book, he's getting all this feedback from people about how to deal with the word religion, how to deal with the word God, and how to open it up. That AA also plays a really important role in influencing Exman and therefore influencing contemporary American culture. So when we see so many people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious today, who aren't going to church because they see the big institutions as not where it happens, but maybe they go to a small Bible study group, or maybe they go to a small yoga class, or maybe they have a book group that's spiritually inclined of 12 people or 16 people. Moving from the big to the small, I think that's another model that AA offers, which was happening. Exman was already involved with that before he got involved in AA. He had a small group that met, a kind of spiritual group that met in New York for many decades. But yeah, I think that AA played a really big role in that shift. Now, can I say one thing about LSD before we move on and
Sure.
Go
for it.
Get all straight and square, among us, because we're cool, we're hip in this room. The thing that I found really interesting about Wilson and Exman on LSD was, first of all, how early it was. One thing that struck me as amazing about Exman is Exman goes to find a guru in the early 60s in India before the Beatles. He doesn't go after the Beatles. He does it before the Beatles. He takes LSD before Timothy Leary, before all the people at BU who are famous for, dropping acid and experimenting with acid. He does it before. When everybody's going out to California in the 60s, because that's where it's at, that's where everything's happened. When does Exman go to California to start a commune dedicated to, religious exploration? He goes in the 40s. And he establishes an organization that is still there today that really, folds. It goes between like 42 and 49, but it gets picked up by these Hindus who run the place now. So he's out in front of things, as Bill Wilson was out in front of things. But when it comes to LSD, neither of them was doing this as a countercultural thing. One of the arguments I make is this was a cultural rather than a countercultural project. This was an elite rather than an outsider project. These were doctors and nurses were there when you were taking your exactly prescribed, micrograms of LSD. They were recording the sessions on reel-to-reel tapes so that they could learn from them. They were playing Beethoven in the background. They weren't playing the Beatles or like Elvis or rock and roll or anything. They were looking at like what they considered to be beautiful art, which is the kind of art that would hang in the Louvre, not the kind that would be, made by action painters in New York in the early 1960s. And they were doing it. Why? They weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because they believed that the pathway to God, the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley put it, would be opened up if you took this drug. And Exman believed that's what was needed to save the world from militarism and from all the other ravages of the 20th century. And Bill Wilson believed that you needed to have a spiritual experience in order to benefit from all the processes of AA. And he saw too many people who couldn't make that breakthrough. And so they kept relying on themselves and their own pride and their own self-effort. And so he thought that this might be a way to fix that problem. So I really see it as his move as faithfulness to the AA project rather than some diversion from the AA project, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense to me. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, you mentioned Ann Taves's book, and Ann Taves is a brilliant religious scholar out on the West Coast. I think she's at UC Santa Barbara, and her book that you talked about is called Revelatory Events.
Thank you. Revelatory Events.
She does it's a little bit of a scholarly read, but she deals with Mormonism and Alcoholics Anonymous and the Book of Miracles.
Yeah, the Course in Miracles.
And the Course in Miracles. Yeah. And I found it to be a really, really exciting book to read. Ann Taves actually came to one of the symposiums on AA history that we had years ago and gave a presentation. She was just great. She's just great. And she's somebody worth paying attention to and following if you're interested in religion and spirituality, what's going on in the United States of America in the 20th century. And today, she's very, very current. She's a player, so that's good. Listen, I see my friend Patrick O'Donnell is here, and Patrick is, as I've wanted to get the two of you together to tell you the truth, but one of the things Patrick pays attention to is more than anything else is Sam Shoemaker. He's one of the guys who's a fan of Sam Shoemaker and his influence and impact on Alcoholics Anonymous. And he asked me to ask you, which I never got around to doing, if in fact Sam Shoemaker was ever part of that Gramercy Park club. That to your knowledge, was he ever a part of that club, or was he? Did he know Eugene Exman? Was he in the circle there, the club in that they used to meet weekly?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I certainly haven't seen any evidence that he was part of the small group that met in various apartments in New York for 20 or 30 years. He might well have come. I don't know about that. Exman didn't publish him. But yeah, I know he's important to the AA story, but I'm not so sure about whether he and Exman crossed paths. They may well have, and I just wouldn't have known.
If I'm not, I think maybe Exman published his wife's bio of him at one point later.
Interesting. Okay, interesting. I didn't know that. That doesn't surprise me because I keep running across books he published that I haven't read. So
Right.
that would make sense to me.
How many books do you think he was responsible for publishing? You got a number on that?
Well, certainly over 1,000, probably between 1,000 and 5,000, I would guess, and
Wow.
hundreds of best-selling books.
Wow. All right. Well, I think, Stephen, I think we burned our hour here.